You already know this has finished. Not ended the way a conversation ends, or a relationship cools, but finished. The way a body finishes healing from something it was never supposed to survive. There is a quality to this moment that you recognize, and it is not pride, it is not relief. It is something closer to the feeling of weight, not burden, not grief, but weight in the original sense, mass, presence, the particular gravity of a thing that has become real. You recognize this. The explaining has stopped, not because you decided, in some bright moment of resolution, that you would no longer justify yourself. Decisions of that kind belong to the early stages, when the ego still believes it is managing a situation. No, the explaining stopped because something underneath the explaining completed its task, withdrew its energy from that old channel, and left it dry. You opened your mouth one day, and the familiar current was gone. What remained was silence, not hostile, not wounded, simply the silence of a space that no longer needed to be filled. I want to speak to you today about what that silence means. Not what it communicates to others, we will come to that, but what it reveals about what has happened inside you. Because something has happened, something that the people around you cannot fully name. Though you will notice, if you have not already, that they have begun to try. They call it coldness, they call it distance, one or two of them. The more perceptive ones will say that you have changed, and they will say it with an unease that surprises them. They expected to feel concern for you. Instead, they feel something that sits closer to caution. This is not an accident, and it is not a wound. In my work on the structure of the psyche, particularly in those years when I was observing the dissolution of the persona, in patients who had carried enormous relational weight for most of their lives, I noticed a pattern that was consistent enough to constitute what I would call a psychological law. The person who has organized their inner life around legibility, around the continual task of making themselves understandable, approachable, safe to others, does not simply stop performing that function when they heal. The function collapses structurally. The persona that was built to translate the self into something others could receive without distress, that structure does not retire gracefully. It disintegrates, and what is revealed beneath it is not the wound everyone assumed was there. It is something older, harder, and far less interested in being witnessed. Let me be precise about what I mean by the persona here, because the word is often misused. The persona is not falsehood. It is not manipulation. In its healthy form, it is the necessary interface between the individual and the collective, the set of adaptations that allow a person to function within a social field without bleeding continuously into it. But in those who have been trained from early life to overfunction relationally, to absorb the emotional states of others, to calibrate their own expression constantly against the discomfort they might cause, the persona does not simply adapt to the social field. It becomes indistinguishable from the self. The person does not put on legibility each morning. They are legibility, transparency, accessibility. They have learned at a level far below conscious choice that their survival, or at least the survival of their connections, depends on remaining readable. What this costs over decades is not merely energy. What it costs is mass. I use that word deliberately. There is a quality of psychological substance of what I might elsewhere call the weight of the individuated self that cannot be maintained when the psyche is continuously organized around the task of being comprehensible to others. To be perpetually readable is to be perpetually edited. And what is edited, session by session, year by year, is precisely the parts of the self that are most dense, most particular, most irreducible, the parts that do not translate easily, the anger that cannot be softened into sadness without losing its nature, the refusal that cannot be rephrased as a question without becoming something else entirely, the silence that means no, not maybe, not let me understand your perspective, not I need to think about this, but simply, finally, no. These are the parts that accumulated in the dark while the persona continued its work above, and then something happened. Perhaps it was a single moment, a conversation in which you heard yourself begin to explain and felt, for the first time, a distinct absence of belief in the explanation, not dishonesty, not cynicism, simply the awareness that the explanation was a form, and the form was no longer connected to anything alive inside you. Or perhaps it was slower than that, a gradual reduction, like a tide that recedes so steadily that one morning you simply notice the shore is different. Whatever the timing, the structure gave way. The persona that had been organized around legibility lost its center, and into that collapse came everything that had been waiting. I said a moment ago that what is revealed when this structure falls is not the wound. I want to stay with that because it contradicts what most people, including the person undergoing it, expect to find. The assumption, held by the culture and often by the individual themselves, is that beneath the relational overfunctioning lies damage, rawness, a self so depleted by the labor of caregiving that it requires tending. And there is truth in this, the wound exists. I will not deny it, and we will speak of it in its proper place. But the wound is not what the collapse reveals first. What the collapse reveals first is power, not power as dominance, not power as aggression, though aggression is there too, finally integrated rather than converted into apology. I mean power in the sense that physicists use it to the capacity to affect without being moved, the capacity to remain in a room without reshaping yourself to fit the room's expectations, the capacity to be perceived without managing the perception. This is what begins to emerge when the explaining stops. And it is this, not the silence itself, not even the emotional withdrawal, that the people around you register as threatening. They do not know what to do with someone who does not need to be understood. Think of it from the position of those who have organized their relationship to you around your legibility. They have known consciously or not that you could be reached through guilt, through the presentation of need, through the particular social grammar of implied disappointment. These were the doors through which emotional demand entered your psyche. And you answered them because the persona was structured precisely to hear those doors open and move toward them. That movement, that reflexive, preconscious moving toward the need of the other, was not only your behavior, it was your identity. It was, in a very real sense, the agreement upon which every significant relationship in your life was built. When you stopped explaining, you were not simply withdrawing information. You were withdrawing the proof of the agreement, and without that proof, the other person cannot locate the door. They knock where the door used to be and find a wall. Not hostile, you understand this simply sealed. The sealed wound, the place where something that was once open has closed. Not in rejection, but in completion. Again and again in my patience, I saw the moment when this sealing was first registered by others. It rarely produced the response one might expect: anger, confrontation, direct expression of grievance. More often it produced a kind of bewildered repetition. The people who had previously known how to reach them began to try the same approaches with increasing pressure, as though the problem were volume rather than structure. They spoke more urgently. They invoked history. They named what they believed they were owed, and none of it moved the person sitting across from them, not because the person had hardened, but because the circuitry that used to transmit that particular signal had been rewired entirely. I have called this elsewhere, not in those exact words, but close enough, the end of participation mystique, the dissolution of the unconscious merger through which one's psyche had been borrowing the other's distress and calling it connection. When that merger ends, the one who withdraws is experienced as having committed a kind of violence, not because they have done anything violent, but because the other person can no longer locate the self they had come to depend on, the self that was always reachable, the self that explained. You are no longer that self, and this is where the danger, so-called, begins. Not danger in any ordinary sense. No one will be harmed by your silence, but something in the social field has shifted, and the shift is irreversible. And those around you can feel it, even when they cannot name it. You have become the most dangerous kind of presence in any relational system organized around emotional demand, a presence that is fully there, fully awake, fully perceiving, and entirely without need of resolution. You do not need them to understand. You do not need them to agree. You do not need them to forgive you for becoming unreachable. This is the first thing I want you to see clearly. Before we go any further, not as achievement, not as victory, as fact, the explaining has ended because the need for understanding has ended, and when the need for understanding ends, something in the social field loses its primary lever. What comes after that in you and in them is what we are here to examine. There's a dream I want to bring to you now, not as illustration, not as metaphor assembled for effect, but because the psyche, when it undergoes a structural change of this magnitude, does not announce the change in waking language. It announces it in images. And the images that appear in patients at this precise threshold, when the explaining has stopped and the new weight has not yet been fully named, tend to share a particular quality that I find impossible to ignore. The dream is this: a room. You are inside it. The room is familiar in the way that dreams make things familiar, not because you have been there in waking life, but because the body in the dream knows its dimensions without measuring them. There are doors, several of them, and one by one, across the course of the dream, you become aware that each door has been bricked over from the inside, not from without. This is crucial: from within. The brick is not punishment. It is not imprisonment. The air in the room is completely calm. You are not distressed. And yet, when you wake, the feeling that remains is not of confinement, but of something that can only be described as settled. I have seen this dream in various forms, in patients at exactly this stage. The room is not a trap, it is a completed interior. The bricking is not an act of defense, it is the natural consequence of an interior that no longer requires external ventilation. What was once needed, the open door, the available exit, the path through which others could enter and be admitted to the inner space, is no longer needed because the interior has become self-sustaining. This is not isolation. Do not confuse what I am describing with withdrawal, in the neurotic sense, with the retreat of a wounded animal into a space too small for it. What I am describing is something structurally opposite. It is the closing of doors that were never truly chosen to be open. Doors that were left ajar not out of generosity but out of a very old, very early terror of what would happen if they were closed. The terror that closing a door meant abandonment, that closing a door meant being found selfish, cold, defective as a human being, that closing a door would result in the loss of every connection that had any meaning. You kept the doors open for decades under that fear. And the people who walked through them, some of them aware of the fear, most of them not organized their access to you around it. They did not think of it as exploitation. Very few people consciously exploit the fear of another. What they did was simpler and more unconscious. They learned the layout of the open house. They knew which rooms were accessible. They knew how long they could stay. They knew which expressions of need would prompt which responses. And they returned to this knowledge the way anyone returns to a familiar place without examining it, without questioning whether the arrangement was fair, because the arrangement had always worked until it stopped working. I want to speak carefully here about what I observed in the clinical situation when this kind of access ended, not abruptly, not through confrontation, but through the quiet structural change that we have been tracing, because the response from those who had depended on access is not uniform, and its variety is instructive. There are those who respond with escalation. They increase the pressure, they invoke the history of the relationship, the years, the shared experiences, the sacrifices made. They remind you who you were to them and imply that this is who you must remain. What they are doing, though they do not know it, is attempting to reactivate the old persona. They believe, because it was always true before, that sufficient emotional pressure applied at the right points will restore the accessible self. They are treating you as a mechanism that has temporarily malfunctioned, rather than as a structure that has fundamentally changed. This is the first consequence of the silence that I want to name, precisely the collapse of the other's predictive model. Every relationship rests, at some level, on the ability of each person to anticipate the other. Not perfectly anticipation is not control, but sufficiently. The person who once knew how to reach you knew, in a functional sense, who you were. They had a model of you that was accurate enough to navigate by. When the explaining stopped, the model became useless. And a person whose model has become useless does not experience this as a neutral event. They experience it as a kind of vertigo. The ground of the relationship, which felt solid because it was organized around your legibility, has shifted beneath them, and they reach for what they have always reached for: increased expression of need, increased invocation of obligation, and find that it no longer produces traction. Some of them, after a period of this, to begin to feel something they will not name, but that operates as suspicion. Something has changed in you, not just your behavior, something underneath the behavior. They cannot locate it precisely, but they feel it as a kind of unreadability. And unreadability in someone who was previously always readable registers. At a deep level, as threat, not physical threat, but the threat that comes from encountering a consciousness that is no longer organized around your comfort. In my work on the development of the individual, in those years of tracing the movement from participation mystique toward genuine psychological separateness, I observed that this unreadability is almost always interpreted by the group as moral failure. This is important. When the persona of legibility collapses, the collective does not say this person has individuated. It says this person has become selfish, cold, unavailable. And these accusations carry real social weight. They are not trivial. They are the mechanisms through which the collective attempts to restore the prior arrangement, to reimpose the legibility that it depended on by framing its absence as a defect of character. You will have heard these accusations. Perhaps you still hear them. And I want to say something about them that I suspect you have not yet fully allowed yourself to hear. They are not entirely wrong. This will surprise you, perhaps disturb you, but I mean it precisely. And I want to be precise. The accusation of coldness contains a kernel of phenomenological truth. Something in you has cooled not toward warmth as an experience, not toward love or care in their genuine forms, but toward the particular warmth that was performed in service of access, the warmth that said, I am open to you, I will not close against you. Whatever distress you bring to this encounter, I will absorb it rather than let it turn back toward you. That warmth which was never true warmth, but rather a sophisticated and largely unconscious form of appeasement, has in fact cooled, and the people who experienced it as warmth experience its absence as cold. The accusation of unavailability is also, in a technical sense, accurate. You are unavailable, not to everyone, but to the particular demands that once organized your availability. The guilt-shaped knock, the need-framed entry, the presentation of wound designed to activate your inherited sense that another's pain is your responsibility to relieve. These specific modes of access, yes, you have become unavailable to them. The door that once opened to those particular sounds has been bricked. What the accusation misses, what it cannot see from where it stands, is that the thing it is mourning was never truly given. It was extracted not through force, through structure, through the accumulated weight of early learning that told you the cost of unavailability was too high to pay. The warmth that is now missing was not a free gift. It was a tithe paid to keep the connection intact. And when you stopped paying it, when the structure that generated the tithe dissolved, what the other person lost was not your warmth. What they lost was their leverage. This distinction matters enormously, because as long as you believe that what you withdrew was genuine care, as long as you carry the accusation of coldness as a verdict rather than as a symptom of the other person's disorientation, you remain partially inside the old structure. The guilt still has a hook in you, small, perhaps buried deeper than before, but present Let me describe the second kind of response I observed in those whose access ended, because it is subtler and in some ways more revealing than the escalation. There are those who go quiet, who do not increase pressure, but instead withdraw, sometimes partially, sometimes entirely, and who, when they do speak, speak with a particular quality that I can only describe as careful, as though they are navigating a space they no longer know the dimensions of, as though they are aware, at some level below articulation, that something has shifted in the power structure of the relationship and they have not yet determined how to position themselves within the new arrangement. These are the more perceptive ones, and their caution is not irrational. They are responding accurately to something real, because what has happened, what you carry now, in the silence and the weight and the sealed interior, is not merely the absence of the old accessibility. It is the presence of something that was never there before in its current form. I want to name it carefully. When the psyche stops organizing itself around the task of being legible to others, the energy that was consumed by that task does not simply dissipate, it returns. It does not return cleanly. Nothing in the psyche returns cleanly, but it returns, and what it returns as, in the initial period, is often experienced by the person themselves as a kind of uncomfortable fullness, a density, a sense of taking up more space than one is accustomed to. The body may register it first, a different quality to the physical presence in a room, a different relationship to silence, a different awareness of being perceived. I have written elsewhere of the way the shadow, those aspects of the personality that have been systematically excluded from the persona, accumulates its own form of pressure over decades of repression. Not repression in the simple sense of being pushed down and held, but repression in the more precise sense, excluded from the light of consciousness, denied integration, forced to find expression through indirect channels, through the body, through dreams, through the inexplicable intensity of certain emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to their apparent causes. In the person who has spent decades over-functioning relationally, the shadow contains specific material, not random accumulation. Specific, the anger that was converted into sadness to make it more acceptable, the refusal that was rephrased as a question to avoid the appearance of rigidity, the judgment, and there has always been judgment, sharp and accurate, that was continuously suppressed because judgment in someone who presents as endlessly empathic is felt by others as a betrayal of their implicit contract. The desire for solitude that was masked as tiredness, the boredom, the impatience, the occasional, fleeting, completely human contempt, all of it accumulated, and when the persona dissolved, it did not burst out, it did not explode into behavior, it integrated slowly, imperfectly, in the way that everything psychological integrates, not through a clean decision, but through repeated exposure, through the gradual lowering of the interior alarm that had always sounded when these materials approached consciousness. And as they integrated, they changed the texture of the person. This is what the perceptive ones sense when they go careful. They are sensing the integrated shadow, the anger that has been metabolized rather than suppressed, the judgment that is present but not performed, the refusal that exists as a structural fact rather than as a response to a specific request. These are not aggressive presences, but they are dense ones, and density, genuine psychological density, is felt by others as gravity, as weight, as a kind of pressure that does not push but that is undeniably there. You have become someone who is fully present without being available. And this, I will tell you plainly, is what the room does not know how to hold. There is a second dream. It comes later than the first, not always in time, but in sequence. The sequence matters because the psyche does not present its revelations arbitrarily. The first dream, the bricked room, the sealed interior, the calm air, that dream belongs to the moment of completion. It is the psyche's announcement that the structure has closed. The second dream belongs to what comes after, to the period when the closed structure begins to be inhabited rather than simply recognized. In this dream, you are standing at a table. The table is large, larger than any table you would encounter in ordinary life. But the dream accepts its dimensions without question. There are others in the room. They enter, they move around you, some of them speak, some of them approach, and throughout all of this you do not look up, not from rudeness, not from hostility, not from the performed indifference of someone making a point. You do not look up because you are genuinely, completely occupied with what is in front of you. The others enter the field of your peripheral awareness. You know they are there. The dream makes this clear, but their entry does not constitute a claim on your attention. It does not activate the familiar interior movement, that preconscious turning toward, that reflexive reorientation of the self around the presence of another. You remain at the table, occupied, whole. When patients brought me this dream, or dreams with this essential structure, I noticed a consistent quality in the way they described it upon waking. There was always a brief uncertainty about whether the dream had been kind or cruel, whether the figure at the table was integrated or simply shut down, whether what they had experienced as wholeness in the dream was actually, in some more honest register, disconnection dressed in the language of peace. I understand this uncertainty. I do not dismiss it, because the psyche, in its movement toward individuation, passes through territories that closely resemble territories. It has already known territories of numbness, of dissociation, of the particular absence that trauma produces when it teaches the organism that presence is too costly. The person who has spent decades over-functioning relationally knows that absence. They have been there. They have lived in the low-grade anesthesia of continuous self-suppression and called it coping. And when something new begins to feel like absence, when the turning toward reflex stops firing, when the room fills and they do not reorganize themselves around its contents, there is always the question, is this health, or is this the old wound wearing a different face? I want to answer this question directly, because it deserves directness. The difference between the numbness of trauma and the stillness of integration is not found in the feeling. Both can feel like quiet. Both can feel like distance. The difference is found in what is available beneath the quiet. In the traumatic absence, beneath the stillness, there is contraction, there is a held breath, there is the body's memory of what it costs to be present, keeping the organism in a permanent defensive posture that it has learned to experience as normal. When you probe beneath that stillness, you find fear, specifically the fear that presence will again be extracted rather than shared. In the stillness of integration, beneath the quiet, there is something different. There is, and I choose this word precisely, readiness, not the readiness of someone braced for impact. The readiness of something that has reached its own ground and stands on it without effort. The anger is there, but it is not hot. It is structural, like the tensile strength of a material rather than the heat of a reaction. The judgment is there, clear and unperformed. The refusal is there, not as a wall constructed against intrusion, but as a simple fact about the interior. This is not available, not as statement, as condition. This is the stillness the figure at the table inhabits, and the reason the others in the dream enter and are not attended to is not because the figure is absent from them. It is because the figure is more present to itself than it has ever been. And a self that is fully present to itself does not automatically reorient around the arrival of another. It notices, it registers, and it continues. Now I want to speak about what this costs, because there is a cost. I said earlier that what the accusers miss those who name the silence as coldness. The ceiling as selfishness is that what they are mourning is leverage rather than love. And this is true, but it is not the complete truth. The complete truth includes what you feel in certain moment when the old reflex fails to fire and you observe its absence. There are people you love genuinely in the ways that cannot be manufactured or withdrawn, and there are moments when their distress arrives and you feel the old circuitry attempt to activate and find that it cannot complete its former movement. The signal goes out and comes back changed. What returns is not indifference. What returns is something more like witnessing. You see the distress. You are not unmoved by it, but you are no longer organized around resolving it. You no longer experience their discomfort as a condition that your interior must immediately address. This is, I will tell you honestly, one of the most disorienting experiences of genuine individuation, because it challenges the deepest assumption that the over-functioning empath has carried the assumption that their care was always real, always chosen, always freely given. When the compulsive component falls away and what remains is this witnessing quality, the person is left with a question they did not anticipate: how much of what I called love was actually anxiety. I do not ask this to diminish what was given. I ask it because the question is necessary, because without asking it, the person cannot fully inhabit the new structure. They remain partially bound to the old one, bound by guilt, by the suspicion that the witnessing is a failure rather than a maturation, by the fear that genuine love would look more like what it used to look like, would look, that is, like dissolution. In my work on individuation, in the long years of observing human beings move from the collective identity towards something genuinely their own, I observe that every significant stage of development produces a grief that is proportional to the growth, not in spite of the growth. Because of it, the grief of individuation is not the grief of loss in the ordinary sense. It is the grief of a self meeting, for the first time, the full dimensions of what it had been doing to itself in the name of love. The empath who reaches this stage, who has stopped explaining, who carries the new weight, who no longer reorients around the arrival of others. This person grieves, not dramatically, not in ways that are easy to locate or name. The grief tends to move through the body rather than through speech. It appears in the particular heaviness of certain evenings, in the moments of looking at someone who once reached them through guilt and feeling, instead of the old contraction, something that is almost tenderness, but a tenderness that is fully separate, fully boundaried, fully aware that it will not be translated into action on their behalf. This is a grief worth sitting with, not resolving, not explaining, sitting with, because what is being grieved is not the relationship. Exactly. What is being grieved is the version of yourself that organized around the relationship. The self that was always translating its own experience into terms the other could receive. The self that could not enter a room without first scanning it for distress that needed managing. The self that experienced its own emotions as secondary, not in any grand, conscious hierarchy, but in the simple, automatic, perpetual way of someone who has learned that their interior is primarily useful as a resource for others. That self is gone, and it should be gone, and its going is, in the most precise sense of the word, a death. I have called this elsewhere the death of the false self, though that phrase, stripped of its clinical context, is often misunderstood as an indictment. It is not an indictment. The false self was not a lie. It was an adaptation extraordinarily sophisticated, extraordinarily costly to conditions that made the true self dangerous to display. The child who learned that their need was too much, their anger unacceptable, their refusal and abandonment of those who depended on them, that child did not choose to build a false self. They built the only self the environment could sustain. And they built it so well, maintained it so continuously, that by adulthood it had become indistinguishable from identity. When it dissolves, the grief is real, the disorientation is real. The question, who am I, without the explaining, without the availability, without the continuous labor of being understood, that question is real, and it deserves to be held as real rather than immediately answered. But I want to stay with one more dimension of this cost before we reach the territory I most want to bring you to. Because there is a social cost that operates alongside the interior grief, and it is one that the individuating person is often unprepared for. When you become unreadable, when the persona of legibility dissolves, and what replaces it is the genuine self in its new density, you do not simply lose the people who were accessing you through guilt. You also lose something from the people who loved you well, who were not using you, who engaged with you genuinely within the terms of the old structure, and who now find that the terms have changed in ways they did not anticipate and were not consulted about. These people, the ones who loved the version of you that was always explicable, always approachable, always available for the particular kind of intimacy that legibility makes possible, these people experience the change as a kind of substitution. The person they knew has been replaced by someone they are still learning, and the learning is effortful in ways they did not sign up for, because the new self, the individuated self, the self that stands at the table without looking up, requires a different kind of meeting, not less. Different. It requires the other person to arrive as a self rather than as a need, to engage at a level of genuine separateness rather than the comfortable merger that legibility had always enabled. Some of them cannot make that adjustment. Not because they do not love you, because the particular form of love they had developed was calibrated to the old structure, and the old structure is no longer available. What they feel when they encounter the new version of you is not rejection, exactly, but a kind of friction that has no precedent in the relationship's history. And that friction, depending on the person and their own psychological resources, either becomes the beginning of a deeper meeting, or it becomes the quiet end of the connection. You cannot control which it becomes. And this inability to manage the outcome, to explain yourself into a form that makes the loss unnecessary, this is perhaps the purest expression of what has completed inside you. You are no longer willing to become legible in order to preserve the connection, not because you do not care whether the connection survives, but because the cost of legibility is now one you simply cannot pay. The currency no longer exists in you. You spent the last of it the last time, you explained, and here is where I want to bring you to something that most accounts of this transformation either overlook or deliberately soften. The power that accumulates in the silence, in the sealed interior, in the unperformed judgment, in the anger that has been integrated until it is structural rather than reactive. This power is not neutral. It is not simply the natural consequence of health, to be appreciated in the abstract and then set aside. It is active, it functions, it exerts a pressure on every relational field you enter, regardless of whether you intend it. You have become, in the most precise psychological sense, a differentiating force. Your presence alone, without action, without speech, often without awareness, operates as a kind of mirror for everyone around you. Not the mirror that reflects what they wish to see, the other kind, the kind that shows the structure beneath the presentation, the kind that reveals, by its very refusal to be managed, what every managed relationship in the room depends on for its survival. This is not something you do to others. It is something you are now in this stage, and it is this, not your silence, not your withdrawal, not your refusal to explain that the room identifies, without being able to name it, as dangerous. Not dangerous because you will harm anyone. Dangerous because you are the proof that the agreement was always optional. The agreement was always optional. I want to stay with that for a moment before we move into what remains, because it is the sentence that the system, the relational system, the family system, the social system organized around your continuous availability cannot absorb without restructuring itself entirely. And systems do not restructure willingly. They restructure only when the cost of maintaining the old form exceeds the cost of change, which means that the system, when it encounters you now, does not simply adjust. It resists. It applies pressure. It generates the particular social weather that surrounds anyone who has withdrawn their participation from an arrangement that others depend on. You will have felt this weather. It does not always arrive as accusation. Sometimes it arrives as concern. The people who present themselves as worried about you, who frame the change in you as something that needs addressing, correcting, healing, these people are, in the most charitable reading, genuinely disturbed by what they sense. In a less charitable reading, They are attempting to reframe your health as pathology in order to restore the conditions that serve them. Both readings can be simultaneously true. Human motivation is rarely clean. What I want to say about this weather is simple. It is not information about you. It is information about the system's investment in your former self. The intensity of the pressure tells you, with considerable precision, how much of the system's functioning depended on your legibility. The louder the concern, the larger the dependency. This is not a judgment of those who express the concern. It is simply a reading of the structure, and you do not need to respond to it. This is perhaps the most radical thing I will say today, and I want to say it without softening. The expectation that you will respond, that you will account for yourself, justify the change, provide sufficient explanation to make the new version of you acceptable to those who preferred the old one. This expectation is itself the last mechanism of the old structure. It is the final door, the one that remains partially open, not because you chose to leave it open, but because the habit of response runs so deep that closing it feels, even now, like an act of aggression. It is not an act of aggression. It is the completion of a boundary that has been in the process of forming for years. The boundary does not require defense. It does not require announcement. It does not require the elaborate architecture of explanation that you were once so skilled at constructing. It simply exists as a fact about the interior, as a condition of the new structure. I wrote once, in essence, that the most dangerous thing a person can do to a system organized around their wound is to heal completely, not partially, not with the residual guilt that makes the healing palatable to others, completely. What I meant by that, what I have seen confirmed in patient after patient who reached this stage, is that complete healing does not look, from the outside, like what healing is supposed to look like. It does not look like reconciliation. It does not look like the warm return to connection after a period of necessary withdrawal. It looks, from the outside, like a permanent change in the terms of engagement. And permanent changes in the terms of engagement are experienced by those who benefited from the old terms as a form of abandonment, even when nothing and no one has been abandoned. Let me speak now about what happens inside the body during this period, because the psychological transformation we have been tracing does not remain in the psychological register. It moves, it settles into the physical, and the physical changes are worth attending to because they constitute a kind of evidence, not the evidence of external validation, not the evidence of other people's understanding or approval, but the evidence of the organism itself registering that something has corrected. There is a quality to the breath, not dramatic. Nothing about genuine individuation is dramatic in the way that crisis is dramatic. But there is a quality to the breath in the person who has completed this particular transition that is different from what was there before. It is fuller, not in the sense of being deeper or more conscious. The body does not suddenly begin performing its breathing differently. Fuller in the sense of being less interrupted. The chronic interruption of the breath that accompanies the continuous scanning of the environment for distress that needs managing, that interruption lessens, not all at once, gradually, and in its lessening, the body begins to relearn what it is to inhabit itself without simultaneously monitoring its surroundings for threats it has agreed, unconsciously, to absorb. The shoulders carry it too, and the jaw and the particular set of the eyes that develops in people who have spent decades receiving more information from others' emotional states than those others are consciously transmitting. There's a softening in some of these places, not the softening of relaxation, which is temporary, but the softening of a musculature that no longer needs to hold itself in the posture of perpetual readiness. And alongside the softening, paradoxically, a kind of solidity. The body begins to occupy its own space differently. It takes up, in the most literal sense, the room it is entitled to take. I have called this, in the context of individuation, the body's ratification of the psychological event. The psyche completes something and the body, in its slower, denser rhythm, eventually agrees. And when it agrees, the agreement is total. It is not reversible in the way that decisions are reversible or positions are revisable. The body, once it has ratified the new structure, does not forget. It carries the memory of the old posture of the held breath, of the scanning, of the continuous readiness, but it carries it as a past, as something that happened rather than something that is happening. This is important because there will be moments, there will continue to be moments, for some time, when the old environment reasserts itself, when someone who knew the previous version of you with great intimacy activates, through their presence or their words or the particular quality of their need, the circuitry of the old structure, and in those moments you will feel something that resembles the old movement. The familiar pull toward the explaining, toward the softening, toward the conversion of your refusal into a question that is easier for them to receive. Do not mistake this for regression. Do not interpret the resurgence of the familiar as evidence that the change was superficial. What you are feeling in those moments is the nervous system's memory, its well-worn path, deeply grooved by decades of repetition, activating in the presence of a familiar stimulus. The path is there. It does not disappear because it is no longer used, but you are no longer compelled to walk it. And the difference between the compulsion and its absence, that gap, which may feel very small in the moment, which may feel like nothing more than a slight hesitation before the old response, that gap is the entire territory of what has changed. In that gap lives the integrated anger, the incorporated refusal, the judgment that no longer needs to be hidden because it no longer generates the terror it once did. In that gap, the sealed wound holds, and you choose not from effort, not from discipline, not from the teeth-gritted exercise of a will that is fighting against its own nature, but from the simple fact of who you now are, which direction to walk. Most of the time, you do not walk toward the explaining. Now I want to speak about something that is rarely addressed in the discourse around this kind of transformation, because it requires a precision that the discourse tends to avoid. It requires speaking honestly about the shadow of the healed self, because the healed self has a shadow. The individuated person, the person who has completed the dissolution of the legibility persona and integrated what accumulated beneath it, this person is not without darkness, and the particular darkness they carry is worth examining, not to diminish the achievement of the transformation, but because the unexamined shadow of the healed self is precisely where the next stage of the work waits. The shadow of the healed empath is this: the capacity to be present without being moved can. in certain relational configurations, produce a quality of witness that is experienced by others as judgment even when it is not intended as judgment. The person who no longer reorganizes around the distress of others, who can sit in the presence of another's pain without activating the old machinery of relief. This person sometimes forgets that their stillness, their density, their refusal to be destabilized, is not neutral in its effect on others. It exerts a pressure. It creates a comparison. It can, without any intention, make the other person feel the full weight of their own unprocessed material simply by being in the room with someone who has processed theirs. This is not a reason to return to the old accessibility. It is a reason to carry the new power with a particular kind of awareness, not the awareness that softens the presence, not the return of management and calibration, which would undo everything, but the awareness that genuine power, the kind that comes from integration rather than from performance, carries responsibility, not the responsibility to make others comfortable, not the responsibility to explain, but the responsibility to know what you are and to carry that knowledge without using it as a weapon. The distinction is precise and it matters. There is a version of this transformation that tips, particularly in the early stages, when the integration is new and the relief of not explaining is still vivid, into a kind of coldness that is not structural but chosen. A coldness that uses the language of individuation to justify what is, in truth, a settling of old scores, a punishing by silence that masquerades as boundary, a contempt that has not yet been distinguished from the integrated judgment that preceded it. I am not suggesting this is where you are. I am suggesting it is a territory that borders where you are. And the border is worth knowing, because the goal, if I can use that word without implying a destination that is ever fully reached, the goal of this work is not to become impervious. It is not to become the unmoved mover of every relational field you enter, deriving satisfaction from the discomfort your unreadability produces in others. The goal is something quieter and more demanding than that. It is to become, in the fullest possible sense, real, to be a self that is genuinely present to yourself, to others, to the full weight of what is actually happening in any given encounter without the mediation of the persona that once made you manageable. Real presence is not comfortable. It is not designed for comfort, but it is not cruel. It does not use its own density as a blade. It simply is what it is, without apology and without performance. And it allows others to encounter it on those terms or not at all. This is where the work of this stage ultimately leads, not to isolation, not to the monk's cell or the shut room or the life lived entirely at the table without looking up. Those are images of the transition, not of its completion. The completion looks like something more ordinary and more radical simultaneously. It looks like a person who enters rooms as themselves, who speaks when they have something to say and does not speak when they do not, who can be in the presence of another's need without being governed by it, and who can also. And this is the part that surprises most people who have undergone this transformation, who can also, in certain moments, choose freely to respond to that need, not from compulsion, not from guilt, not from the terror of what will happen if they do not, but from something that is finally actually chosen. Chosen care is a different thing from compulsive care. It looks similar from the outside, in the moments when it appears, but it carries no resentment. It generates no depletion in the way that the old labor generated depletion. It does not accrue as debt in the interior ledger that the over-functioning self always kept the ledger of all the times the self was given away. All the times the door was left open when every instinct said to close it. All the times the explanation was offered and received and used, and the self went home emptier than it arrived. That ledger is closed. Not forgiven, I am not speaking of forgiveness, which is a different matter and a different lecture. Closed, the accounting has stopped. The debt is no longer being tracked because the system that generated the debt no longer exists. What exists in its place is something that does not yet have a name comfortable enough for most people to use, a self that is both fully present and fully intact, that gives what it chooses to give and withholds what it chooses to withhold, that can be in the world without being consumed by it. The room senses this. The room has always sensed this, even before you were fully aware of it yourself. And the room's response, the caution, the unease, the careful navigation of a presence that can no longer be predicted or leveraged or reached through the old channels, the room's response is not your problem to solve. It never was. What has completed inside you is not a decision, and not a recovery, and not a return to anything that existed before. It is the arrival of a self that the wound had been, all along, attempting to protect. The wound did not fail in its protection. It held what needed holding for as long as holding was required, and now the holding is done. The wound has sealed. What remains is not scar tissue in the diminished sense, not the pale mark of something that once was raw. What remains is structure, density, the irreducible fact of a self that has passed through its own dissolution and arrived, on the other side, as something that no longer requires explanation to exist. You stopped explaining because the self that needed to be explained has been replaced by a self that simply is. That self does not wait for permission. That self does not require understanding. That self has already left the room by the time the room decides how to respond.